When privilege clashes with justice, the outcome is often a lesson neither party can ignore. This story begins with an arrogant socialite and a judge who personifies fairness and discipline. It's a tale of entitlement meeting accountability, a spectacle that captivated everyone present. The courtroom was unusually packed that morning. It buzzed with murmurs and the faint rustle of papers as people settled into their seats. Whispers filled the air, not about the case itself, but about the woman at its center, Tiffany Halstead. A socialite whose name was synonymous with scandals and tabloid headlines, Tiffany had been called to face Judge William Grant. Judge Grant wasn't your average judge. In his mid-50s, he was an imposing figure both physically and intellectually. Known for his razor-sharp wit, calm authority, and unwavering fairness, he commanded respect in every courtroom he entered. To stand before him was not just to face judgment, but to confront the truth, often harsh and unvarnished. Tiffany, however, was the complete opposite of Judge Grant in every conceivable way. She arrived at the courthouse fashionably late, as though attending a gala. Dressed in her finest designer attire and oversized sunglasses, she sauntered into the room, oblivious to the seriousness of the setting. Her lawyer trailed behind her, visibly uncomfortable, trying to manage the fallout of her blatant disregard for decorum. As Tiffany entered, conversations halted, and all eyes turned toward her. She paused midway down the aisle, seemingly unaware, or uncaring, that the court was waiting for her to take a seat. She placed her bag on the bench with an air of entitlement, then removed her sunglasses with theatrical flair, scanning the room as if expecting applause. The tension in the room shifted the moment Judge Grant entered. The bailiff called, "All rise," and the crowd obeyed with swift reverence. Tiffany hesitated, rolling her eyes before reluctantly standing. Her body language screamed defiance. Arms crossed, a bored expression on her face, and an audible sigh that rippled through the silent courtroom. Judge Grant, calm and composed, began the proceedings. Tiffany's charges were straightforward: multiple parking violations and an incident of reckless driving that had endangered a pedestrian. But Tiffany's attitude transformed a routine case into an unforgettable courtroom drama. As Judge Grant outlined the charges, Tiffany leaned back in her chair, exuding disinterest. She tapped her manicured nails against the wooden table, loud enough to draw attention. Her lawyer whispered urgently to her, trying to curb her behavior, but she brushed him off with a flick of her wrist. When asked to confirm her identity, Tiffany barely glanced up. "Yeah, that's me," she said, her tone dripping with indifference. The courtroom collectively inhaled, stunned by her blatant disrespect. Judge Grant paused, his sharp gaze fixed on her. "Miss Halstead," he said in a calm but commanding tone, "this courtroom adheres to a standard of decorum. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." Tiffany smirked, twirling a strand of her blonde hair. "Sure thing, Your Honor," she replied, her voice laced with sarcasm. Gasps rippled through the room, and even her lawyer buried his face in his hands, visibly mortified. Judge Grant didn't flinch. Instead, he continued with quiet authority, his voice steady and deliberate. The tension in the room thickened as Tiffany's disrespect escalated. When he asked if she understood the charges, Tiffany rolled her eyes again, sighing audibly. "Honestly? No. It's just some dumb parking tickets and one guy getting scared because I hit the gas too hard. This is a waste of time." The courtroom fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Judge Grant set his folder down and removed his glasses, folding them carefully before addressing her again. "Miss Halstead," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I would advise you to choose your words carefully from this point forward." For the first time, Tiffany seemed unsure. Her smirk faltered, but only for a moment. She shrugged dismissively. "What? It's not like I hurt anyone. This whole thing is ridiculous." Judge Grant leaned back slightly, his sharp eyes never leaving her. "You believe this is ridiculous?" he asked, his tone conversational but laced with authority. "Yeah, I do," Tiffany replied, crossing her arms. "It's not like I robbed a bank or anything." Judge Grant nodded, his expression unchanging. "Let me clarify something for you, Miss Halstead. The charges against you include reckless driving and endangering a pedestrian. The law does not measure accountability by the size of the crime, but by its impact. Do you understand that? Tiffany muttered under her breath. Sure, whatever. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. He gestured to a document and began reading aloud. The pedestrian she had endangered, he revealed, was Edward Lopez, a 67-year-old retired teacher who had been crossing the street legally when Tiffany accelerated toward him. He had stumbled, injuring his wrist in the process. Tiffany's smirk disappeared. For the first time, she glanced nervously at her lawyer. He whispered something urgently, but she waved him off again. I didn't hit him, she muttered defensively. He was fine. Judge Grant's voice hardened slightly. Does this sound like fine to you, Miss Halstead? Does this sound like no harm, no foul? Tiffany's defiance flickered but didn't fully fade. I honked. He moved. End of story, she said, her voice quieter but still dismissive. Judge Grant's silence was deafening. He leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the room. Miss Halstead, he said, you fail to grasp the seriousness of your actions. This courtroom will not tolerate such blatant disregard for the law or for the lives of others. The first cracks in Tiffany's arrogance were beginning to show. What she didn't realize was that Judge Grant wasn't finished. This was only the beginning of her confrontation with the justice system and the reality she had long ignored. The courtroom, now engulfed in an electrifying tension, watched as Judge Grant prepared to continue. Tiffany Halstead's dismissive attitude had been a glaring insult to both the law and the people in the room. What she failed to anticipate was how the judge would use the very weight of justice to challenge her entitled perspective. Judge Grant turned to the bailiff. Please bring in the witness, he said with a calm authority that silenced the murmurs in the room. Moments later, Edward Lopez entered. He was a slender man with a humble demeanor, his arm in a sling, a faint but visible sign of the injury caused by Tiffany's recklessness. He moved cautiously toward the witness stand, nodding politely at the judge before taking his seat. Tiffany watched with mild disinterest, but the sight of Edward sparked a shift in the room's energy. Here was a man whose life had been directly impacted by her actions, a living reminder of the consequences she had so casually dismissed. Mr. Lopez, Judge Grant began. Could you please recount the events of that day for the court? Edward cleared his throat, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. I was crossing the street at a marked crosswalk. The light was in my favor. I saw her car approaching, but I assumed she'd stop. She didn't. Instead, she sped up. He paused, glancing briefly at Tiffany, who now looked slightly uncomfortable. I panicked, he continued. I tried to move faster, but I tripped and fell. That's when I hurt my wrist. Tiffany shifted in her seat, her confidence visibly wavering for the first time. She opened her mouth to speak, but her lawyer placed a firm hand on her arm, silently urging her to remain silent. Judge Grant's gaze never wavered from Edward. Mr. Lopez, how has this injury affected your daily life? Edward hesitated, his voice quieter now. I'm retired, but I do a lot of volunteer work, helping kids with tutoring and organizing community events. With this injury, I've had to step back. I can't do things as easily as before. The weight of Edward's words settled heavily over the courtroom. Even Tiffany, who had spent most of the trial exuding indifference, seemed to absorb the gravity of his statement. She glanced nervously at the judge, her earlier bravado now fully replaced by unease. Thank you, Mr. Lopez, Judge Grant said, his voice steady and respectful. Your testimony is invaluable to this court. As Edward left the witness stand, the courtroom remained silent. Judge Grant turned his attention back to Tiffany. Miss Halstead, he said, his voice carrying a deliberate weight. You've now heard directly from the person whose life was impacted by your actions. Do you have anything to say? Tiffany hesitated, clearly torn between her usual defiance and the pressure of the moment. Finally, she muttered, I didn't mean for that to happen. It was an accident. Judge Grant's expression remained impassive. Accidents, he said, are often the result of negligence. This court exists to determine accountability. Your actions that day were not merely accidental. They were reckless. He leaned forward slightly, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. Tell me, Miss Halstead, do you believe that Mr. Lopez's pain and suffering are insignificant Because, in your words, you didn't hit him? The question hung in the air, demanding an answer. Tiffany, visibly flustered, stammered, "No, I mean, I didn't think it was that bad. I didn't realize." "Exactly," Judge Grant interrupted, his voice sharp but controlled. "You didn't realize because you didn't care to. That is the heart of the issue, Miss Halstead. Your privilege has shielded you from understanding the consequences of your actions." The room remained tense as the judge continued. "This case is not merely about parking violations or reckless driving. It is about a pattern of entitlement, a belief that the rules do not apply to you. That belief ends here." Tiffany's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that the tide had fully turned against his client. He leaned in to whisper something to her, but she ignored him, her focus entirely on the judge. Judge Grant gestured to the bailiff. "Bring me the record of Miss Halstead's prior infractions," he said. The bailiff handed over a thick file, which the judge opened and began to review. "Miss Halstead," he said after a moment, "this is not your first encounter with the law. You have accumulated numerous traffic violations over the past 2 years: speeding, illegal parking, running red lights. Do you consider these to be insignificant as well?" Tiffany's face reddened, and she avoided eye contact. "I guess I've made some mistakes," she mumbled. Judge Grant closed the file with a decisive thud. "Mistakes, Miss Halstead, are opportunities to learn and grow. What concerns this court is your apparent refusal to do so. Your repeated violations suggest a disregard not just for the law, but for the safety and well-being of others." The judge's words were a hammer striking a fragile wall of arrogance. Tiffany's composure cracked further, her usual confidence replaced by visible unease. "In light of your actions and attitude," Judge Grant continued, "this court must determine an appropriate consequence, one that will not only hold you accountable but also ensure you understand the gravity of your behavior." The room held its collective breath, waiting to hear what judgment would befall Tiffany Halstead. What she didn't yet realize was that this moment would mark the beginning of a profound transformation, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and the world. The courtroom was silent, a collective tension lingering in the air as Judge Grant prepared to deliver his final verdict. Tiffany Halstead sat rigidly, her earlier confidence replaced by a growing sense of unease. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, each pair silently judging her for the recklessness and entitlement that had brought her here. Judge Grant adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, his commanding presence filling the room. "Miss Halstead," he began, "this court has considered all the evidence, testimonies, and your attitude throughout this trial. The consequences of your actions have been laid bare, and it is clear that your disregard for others has caused harm, not just to Mr. Lopez, but to the broader community." Tiffany's lawyer shifted in his seat, bracing himself for what was to come. Tiffany, on the other hand, stared straight ahead, her hands tightly gripping the edge of the defendant's table. "Justice," the judge continued, "is not merely about punishment. It is about accountability and, where possible, rehabilitation. You have shown little understanding of the impact your actions have had on others, and it is the responsibility of this court to ensure that changes." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Therefore, the court orders the following. First, you will pay restitution to Mr. Lopez for his medical expenses and the loss of his ability to engage in community service. The amount will be determined based on his documented costs and any additional hardships resulting from your actions." Tiffany's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent. "Second," Judge Grant continued, "you are hereby sentenced to 100 hours of community service. However, this is not to be any ordinary community service. You will work directly with individuals who have been victims of reckless driving, hearing their stories, understanding their struggles, and assisting them in their recovery." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. This was no simple slap on the wrist. It was a direct challenge to Tiffany's detachment, forcing her to confront the reality of her actions. "Third," the judge said, his tone firm, "your driver's license will be suspended for 6 months. During this time, you will be required to attend a driving education course focusing on road safety and the responsibilities of being a driver. At the conclusion of the course, you will need to pass both a written and practical exam to have your license reinstated." Tiffany's face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and indignation. Losing her license was an inconvenience she hadn't anticipated, but the judge wasn't done yet. And finally, Judge Grant said, "You will write a public apology to Mr. Lopez and to the community, acknowledging the harm your actions have caused and committing to being a more responsible citizen. This letter will be published in the local newspaper to ensure transparency and accountability." The room remained silent, the weight of the judgment settling over everyone present. Tiffany's lawyer leaned in, whispering something to her, but she barely registered his words. Her mind was racing, grappling with the reality of the consequences she now faced. "Miss Halstead," the judge said, his tone softening slightly, "I hope you understand that these measures are not meant to simply punish you. They are meant to guide you toward a deeper understanding of the responsibility we all carry as members of a community. You have the means and the opportunity to grow from this experience. I urge you to seize it." Tiffany swallowed hard, nodding slightly, though her expression was unreadable. With a firm rap of his gavel, Judge Grant concluded, "Court is adjourned." As the courtroom began to empty, Tiffany remained seated, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She watched as Edward Lopez quietly gathered his belongings and left the room, his presence a lingering reminder of the damage she had caused. For the first time in years, Tiffany felt a weight pressing down on her, a weight she couldn't shrug off with a sarcastic comment or a dismissive shrug. She realized that her privilege had shielded her from consequences for far too long, and now there was no escaping the reality of her actions. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, eager for a statement. Tiffany's lawyer urged her to keep walking, but she paused, her gaze scanning the crowd. She could see the judgment in their eyes, the silent accusations, and for once, she didn't feel the urge to argue or defend herself. As she stepped into the waiting car, she knew that this was just the beginning. The path ahead would be challenging, forcing her to confront not only the consequences of her actions, but also the person she had become. Deep down, she felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, a desire to change, to prove that she could be better. It wouldn't be easy, but perhaps that was the point. Growth, after all, rarely came without struggle.